Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Birthdays are supposed to be warm, familiar, and filled with laughter, but mine had always been different, strained under the weight of unspoken tensions and long-held grudges that no one cared to acknowledge. That night, the dining room was filled with the sounds of silverware scraping against plates, forced laughter bouncing off the walls, and the clinking of wine glasses raised in celebration of another year of my life. The scent of roasted meat and buttered vegetables lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle perfume of expensive colognes and aged whiskey, but none of it could mask the growing unease sitting heavy in my chest. My sister, Vanessa, sat to my right, her posture impossibly perfect, her manicured fingers wrapped delicately around the stem of her glass, swirling the red wine with the kind of arrogance that only comes from knowing you are the center of attention. Her smile was tight, her eyes scanning the room like she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and despite every ounce of self-control I had, I felt my stomach twist in anticipation of whatever she was about to do. Then, as if on cue, she stood up slowly, the scrape of her chair against the polished floor cutting through the idle chatter like a blade, demanding silence without needing to ask for it. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to her as she delicately cleared her throat, placing her glass down with a measured grace that reeked of performance, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, practiced, and laced with false sympathy. "I just wanted to take a moment," she began, glancing around the room like she was gathering strength from their attention, "to say how grateful I am that we could all be here together tonight, celebrating my dear sister's birthday." She placed a hand on my shoulder, the weight of it heavy with insincerity, squeezing just enough to make it feel like a warning rather than a gesture of affection. "And while I have the floor, I thought this would be the perfect time to share some important news with all of you." My grip on my fork tightened as the tension in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, a collective breath held in anticipation of whatever came next. I knew Vanessa, knew the way her mind worked, knew that she never made a move unless she was absolutely certain she had already won, and yet, something about the way she was dragging this moment out made my pulse hammer against my ribs. She exhaled softly, shaking her head like she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear, then let her gaze land on me with a kind of condescending pity that made my skin crawl. "As you all know, losing Mom and Dad was incredibly hard on both of us," she continued, her voice lowering just enough to sound appropriately mournful, "but I have some clarity to offer, something that I think will bring all of us some much-needed closure." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room, then lifted her chin and delivered the blow. Mom and Dad left everything to me in their will. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a hollow, stretched-out beat where I swore I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and then the applause started. It was like a wave crashing through the room, first in hesitant claps, then in full, unrestrained approval, nods of understanding, murmured agreements that, yes, this made sense, this was fair, this was exactly how it should be. My uncles exchanged knowing glances, my cousins whispered to each other with wide, eager eyes, my aunts reached for Vanessa's hand in support, all of them so quick to accept this declaration as an unchangeable truth, not even pausing to wonder if there was more to the story. I sat still, my fingers wrapped loosely around the base of my wine glass, watching Vanessa soak it all in like a queen accepting the admiration of her loyal subjects, a small, victorious smirk barely concealed behind the false humility on her face. She knew exactly what she was doing, playing them like puppets on strings, knowing that once she had them on her side, nothing I said would matter. She turned her gaze back to me, her smile widening just a fraction, waiting, no, expecting me to react, to push back, to argue, to beg, to do anything that would confirm what she had always believed, that I was the weaker one. The one who never saw things coming, the one who would never, ever win. I took a slow sip of my wine, let the bitterness settle on my tongue, then set the glass down carefully, making sure the sound of it meeting the table was the only noise in the room. Because here's the thing. I knew something she didn't. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. The night my parents died, everything changed. not in the way people talk about grief, where the world feels emptier and the air heavier, but in a way that felt sharp, calculated, and irreversible. Like someone had drawn a hard line between what was mine and what was never meant to be. I remember the phone call, the way my hands had gone cold as I listened to the unfamiliar voice on the other end telling me, in careful, rehearsed words, that my mother and father were gone, their car flipped 3 times on a wet road, their lives reduced to nothing more than an entry in a police report. I remember the silence that followed, how my thoughts blurred together in a haze of disbelief, how I sat in my kitchen staring at the tile floor, my fingers curled around the edge of the counter as if holding onto something solid would keep me from unraveling. But most of all, I remember Vanessa. She had arrived at the house less than an hour later, dressed in black despite the fact that no one had even had time to arrange a funeral, her face the perfect mask of controlled sorrow. Her lips pressed together in a way that suggested grief but never quite displayed it. She had hugged me, her arms wrapped around my shoulders in an embrace that felt too firm, too practiced, her breath warm against my ear as she whispered something about how we needed to be strong, how Mom and Dad would have wanted us to stand together, how she would take care of everything so I didn't have to. I should have known right then. I should have recognized the warning signs in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way her hands lingered a little too long on the edges of my mother's desk as she wandered the house like she was already mentally rearranging the furniture. I hadn't thought much of it then, too consumed by the weight of my own loss to pay attention to the way Vanessa was already carving out her victory, but 2 days later, I found the will. It wasn't even intentional, not at first, not in the way someone deliberately goes searching for something they shouldn't find, but more in the way that grief makes you restless, pushing you into spaces you wouldn't normally go, making you open drawers and sift through papers just for the sake of feeling like you're doing something, anything, to make sense of the world again. I had been in my father's study, the room untouched since the last time he had sat at his desk, the scent of his cologne still clinging to the leather chair, the old brass lamp on his desk casting a dim glow over stacks of neatly organized paperwork. I don't know what I was looking for, or if I was even looking for anything at all, but my hands moved on instinct, fingers trailing over the worn wood of his desk before finally landing on the small safe tucked into the corner beneath the bookshelves. The combination was easy, the numbers coming to me as naturally as if I had dialed them in every day of my life, and when the heavy metal door swung open, my breath caught in my throat. Inside, among old insurance papers and stock certificates, lay a single manila envelope with my father's handwriting scrawled across the front, last will and testament. I remember the way my hands had shaken as I pulled it out, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, my heart pounding in my ears as I flipped it open and let my eyes scan the words that changed everything. The estate was split evenly. The house, the savings, the investments, half of everything was meant to go to me, the other half to Vanessa, a fair, rational, undeniable truth that shattered the lie she had built before it had even begun. But it wasn't just the will that mattered, it was the note clipped to the front, written in my father's precise, unmistakable handwriting, the words carefully chosen, as if he had known exactly what would happen when he was gone. Make sure you read this yourself. Do not let Vanessa handle the estate alone. She has her own interests at heart, not yours. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't speculation. It was a warning, a deliberate attempt to protect me from whatever game she was about to play, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. Vanessa had known. She had known there was a will, had known it wouldn't give her the full control she wanted, had known that the only way to get what she believed she deserved was to make sure no one ever saw this document. I had closed the safe slowly, my mind already racing ahead, piecing together every careful move she had made since the moment our parents' deaths were confirmed, every phone call, every conversation, every too-perfect show of grief that had been nothing more than an act to get what she wanted. She hadn't expected me to find this. She hadn't counted on the fact that I would be the one to go through Dad's things, that I would think to check the safe, that I would remember the code after all these years. And that was when the first spark of an idea started to take shape, a slow, deliberate understanding that this wasn't just about confronting her, about holding up the will and expecting her to fold like a house of cards. Vanessa was too smart for that, too calculated, too skilled at bending the truth until it fit whatever reality suited her best. If I wanted to win, I couldn't just have proof. I needed to make sure she had no way out. So I slipped the will back into the envelope, tucked it carefully into my bag, and let a slow smile spread across my face, because for the first time since the phone call, since the funeral arrangements, since Vanessa's carefully crafted speech at the dinner table, I finally felt something other than grief. I didn't just have a will. I had proof that would ruin her. Vanessa had always been good at controlling a room, at shifting conversations in her favor, at making people believe whatever version of reality she wanted them to see, and now that she thought she had won, she leaned into it with an arrogance that made my stomach turn. She had been riding the high of her announcement for days, basking in the attention, accepting condolences with a kind of solemn dignity that made her look like the perfect grieving daughter, the responsible one, the one who had been entrusted with everything because she was the only one capable of handling it. It was sickening to watch, the way she preened under the praise, the way she took each nod of approval as confirmation that she had played this perfectly, that no one would ever question the story she had spun so flawlessly. At first, I let her have it, let her revel in the power she thought she had, let her believe that I had accepted my fate, that I had no choice but to sit back and watch while she took everything that was meant to be split between us. I kept my face neutral, my words measured, my reactions carefully controlled so that nothing I said could tip her off to the fact that I knew the truth, that I had the will, that I was simply biding my time. She was good at manipulation, but she was also impatient, too eager to cement her victory, too caught up in the performance to realize that the real game had only just begun. So I started small, planting seeds of doubt in ways that seemed natural, casual, as if they were nothing more than passing thoughts rather than deliberate attempts to make her slip. Over dinner with our relatives, I brought up little details about our parents' estate, things I remembered from conversations we had long before their deaths, things that I knew she couldn't contradict without exposing herself. I mentioned how Dad had always been insistent on fairness, how he had gone out of his way to ensure that neither of us would ever feel slighted, how he had once told me that he couldn't imagine ever choosing one of us over the other. I watched as she smiled tightly, nodding along as if she agreed, as if she believed it too, but I could see the faintest flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the smallest sign that she was scrambling to find a way to justify the lie she had told. Then I took it further, weaving small inconsistencies into our conversations, slipping in details that forced her to either go along with them or risk exposing that she was making things up as she went. I asked if she had spoken to Dad's lawyer before they passed, if they had ever discussed how things would be handled, if there had been any mention of changes to the will, watching closely for any hesitation, any faltering in her usually seamless storytelling. At first, she was careful, sticking to vague answers, brushing off specifics with practiced ease, but the more I pushed, the more cracks began to show. One evening, while sitting in our parents' living room, surrounded by the relics of their lives that neither of us had yet dared to move, I casually brought up something our mother had told me years ago, a conversation about how she and Dad had sat down together to update their will, making sure everything was in order in case something ever happened to them. I let the words hang in the air, watching as Vanessa's expression barely changed, but her fingers tensed against the armrest of the couch, gripping just a little too hard, a tiny, almost imperceptible sign that my words had struck something beneath the surface. She recovered quickly, of course, smoothing out her expression, forcing a small laugh as she shrugged and said something dismissive about how our parents had always been so meticulous, how it made sense that they would have thought about things like that. But the damage was already done. I had seen the moment of panic, the way her mind had raced to fill in a gap she hadn't prepared for, the way she had faltered, if only for a second, and I knew then that all it would take was one more push to make her stumble completely. Over the next few days, I kept up the act, letting her think I was just reminiscing, just trying to process things, just coming to terms with the way life had changed so suddenly, but every time I spoke, I nudged her a little closer to the edge. waiting for the moment she would inevitably go too far. And then, when she was finally too comfortable, too sure of herself, too convinced that she had me fooled, she made her mistake. It was late in the evening, the two of us sitting across from each other at the dining table, an untouched cup of tea cooling between my hands as I watched her scroll through her phone, her posture relaxed, her expression smug in that infuriating way that told me she had already moved on, that she believed the matter was settled, that she had won. I let a beat of silence stretch between us, then leaned forward just slightly, keeping my voice light, almost curious, as I said, "So, when did you actually get the will? I mean, it must have been so hard, reading through all that legal stuff so soon after they passed." She barely looked up, barely hesitated, barely even considered the words before she said, "Oh, the lawyer sent it over the day after the funeral. Wanted to make sure I had everything squared away as soon as possible." And that was it. That was the moment I knew she had slipped, the moment I felt my stomach twist with a dark, satisfying certainty, because I had been in Dad's office, had opened the safe with my own two hands, had held the real will in my fingers, untouched, exactly where he had left it, which meant that whatever Vanessa had been handed, whatever she had used to convince the rest of the family that she had inherited everything, had been nothing more than a fabrication, a forgery, a lie. She had just sealed her own fate. The weight of the moment sat heavily on my chest, pressing down like an invisible force as I looked around the table, my eyes scanning the faces of family members who had so easily accepted Vanessa's version of events, who had swallowed her lies without hesitation, who had congratulated her for taking what was never meant to be hers. The warm glow of the chandelier cast flickering shadows across the polished wood, the remnants of dinner still scattered across plates, half-empty wine glasses reflecting the soft golden light, but the atmosphere had shifted, the air thick with an almost tangible tension that no one seemed to notice except for me. Vanessa sat across from me, relaxed, smug, her fingers lazily tracing the rim of her glass, her expression one of complete and utter satisfaction, and for a moment I let myself sit in that silence. Let the weight of her arrogance settle over the room, let her believe she had truly won. I could hear the murmur of conversation around me, the soft laughter of distant cousins recounting old stories, the quiet clinking of utensils against porcelain as someone absent-mindedly picked at their plate, but underneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding, an unacknowledged acceptance that this dinner was more than just a celebration of my birthday. It was a passing of power, a moment in which Vanessa had cemented herself as the rightful heir, the unquestioned authority, the one who had been chosen by our parents to carry on their legacy. And then, as the weight of her lie pressed down on the space between us, suffocating in its audacity, I took a slow breath, set down my glass with deliberate precision, and pushed back my chair, the sound of wood scraping against the floor cutting through the noise like a knife, sharp and impossible to ignore. The conversation stuttered to a halt, all eyes turning toward me, faces frozen in mid-laughter, mid-bite, mid-drink, confusion flickering across their expressions as they registered the shift in the room. The unspoken realization that something was about to happen, something none of them had expected. I let the silence stretch, let the tension build, let the weight of anticipation settle over them like a heavy fog before finally speaking, my voice calm, measured, carrying just enough steel to make Vanessa sit up a little straighter, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "I've been thinking a lot about what Vanessa said the other night," I began, my gaze flicking to her just long enough to see the flicker of unease that passed across her face before she masked it with a carefully neutral expression. "About how Mom and Dad left everything to her, how they trusted her to handle their estate, how they made a very specific choice about who should inherit their legacy." There was a murmur of agreement around the table, nods of understanding, a few murmured, "Of course," and "That makes sense," because that was the story they had been fed, the version of reality they had accepted without question. But I wasn't finished. Not yet, not when I had spent the past few days waiting for this exact moment. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the worn edges of the envelope, my heartbeat steady and unwavering as I pulled it out and placed it on the table in front of me. The sound of paper meeting would impossibly loud in the silence that followed. "Here's the thing," I said, my voice slicing through the air with the kind of quiet certainty that made people lean in, made them hold their breath, made them realize that whatever came next was something they weren't prepared for. "That's not what the will actually says." The shift was immediate, a ripple of confusion spreading through the room, eyes darting between me and Vanessa, expressions morphing from curiosity to skepticism, from skepticism to disbelief, from disbelief to something dangerously close to suspicion. Vanessa's smile didn't falter, not yet, but I could see the tension creeping into her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened just slightly, the way her carefully curated composure cracked at the edges as she forced out a laugh that sounded just a little too rehearsed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, shaking her head as if I were the one making a ridiculous claim, as if I were grasping at something that didn't exist, but I didn't give her the chance to regain control of the room. I slid the envelope across the table, letting it land directly in front of her, my gaze steady as I watched her stare down at it, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to snatch it away before anyone else could see it. "Dad kept this in his safe," I continued, my voice unwavering, my words deliberate. "It's the real will, the one he and Mom signed, the one that actually lays out how their estate should be divided." A hush fell over the table, the weight of my words sinking in, pressing down on the people who had so readily accepted Vanessa's version of the truth without ever considering that there might be another. I could see the shift happening in real time, the way the expressions around me changed, the way my relatives exchanged uncertain glances, the way doubt crept into their eyes as they looked at Vanessa, waiting for her to explain, to justify, to find a way to twist this in her favor. She didn't move at first, didn't reach for the envelope, didn't acknowledge it at all, and in that split second of hesitation, I knew that every carefully laid plan she had constructed was beginning to crumble beneath her. But then, just as I thought she might break, she let out a slow breath, lifted her chin, and fixed me with a look so cold, so calculating, that I knew this wasn't over, that she wasn't going to back down without a fight. She reached for the envelope, her fingers moving carefully, deliberately, her expression unreadable as she slid it toward her. But before she could open it, before she could even attempt to spin the narrative back in her favor, I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough that only she could hear me. "But it wasn't just the will," I murmured, watching as the blood drained from her face, as her breath hitched, as the first real flicker of fear passed through her eyes. There was something else. Vanessa had always been quick on her feet, able to twist any situation in her favor, able to turn any accusation into an attack on her character, able to make even the most blatant lies sound like undeniable truths. But as she sat there, her fingers gripping the edge of the envelope like it might somehow disappear if she held it tightly enough, I saw something I had never seen before: uncertainty. For the first time since this entire mess had started, she looked like she wasn't entirely sure of her next move, like the walls were closing in faster than she could find a way out. Like she had spent so much time believing her own deception that the sudden introduction of reality had thrown her completely off balance. The silence in the room stretched unbearably, a thick, suffocating thing that no one dared to break. Every set of eyes locked onto the two of us, waiting for whatever came next. Waiting to see if Vanessa would somehow find a way to slither out of the mess she had created, or if, for once in her life, she would finally have to answer for what she had done. She took a breath, deep and steady, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, tilting her head just slightly like she was amused by my ridiculous accusation, like she was indulging the silly notion that she had done something wrong. Like she was still in control of the narrative. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here," she said smoothly, sliding the envelope back toward me without even bothering to open it, her voice carrying that infuriating tone of condescension that she had perfected over the years. "But I already have the will, the one that was given to me by the lawyer, the one that states exactly what I told everyone. I don't know where you found this or why you think it matters, but dragging this out isn't going to change anything." She was still playing the role, still trying to pretend that I was the one causing unnecessary drama, still hoping that if she spoke with enough confidence, the room would continue to believe her. But what she hadn't counted on, what she had never considered, was that I hadn't come to this dinner unprepared. I had spent the last few days making sure that every possible escape route had been sealed, that every potential loophole had been accounted for, that when I finally put my plan into motion, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. So I didn't respond to her, didn't take the bait, didn't let her redirect the conversation away from the inevitable, because I knew something she didn't. I knew that in exactly 30 seconds, the lawyer she had so confidently claimed to have spoken to would be walking through the front door, and once he did, there would be no more lies, no more gaslighting, no more desperate attempts to rewrite history to suit her own needs. And right on cue, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by the crisp, professional voice of a man who had no patience for manipulation, no tolerance for dishonesty, no interest in playing along with Vanessa's little game. Every head in the room turned as he stepped inside, his briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable, but my focus remained on Vanessa, watching as the blood drained from her face, as her carefully composed facade wavered, as the realization finally set in that she was well and truly trapped. "Sorry for the interruption," the lawyer said, his voice carrying just enough authority to command the full attention of the room, but I was asked to clarify some details regarding Mr. and Mrs. Calloway's estate. He stepped further inside, setting his briefcase down on the table, his sharp gaze flicking between Vanessa and me before settling on the envelope in front of her. "I assume that's the document in question?" Vanessa didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even attempt to protest, and for the first time in her life, she looked truly powerless. The lawyer reached forward, flipping open the envelope with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the contents quickly before nodding to himself, confirming what I had known all along, confirming what Vanessa had spent weeks trying to bury, confirming that she had built her entire victory on a foundation of lies. "This is the legally binding, notarized last will and testament of Thomas and Eleanor Calloway," he announced, his tone leaving no room for debate, no space for argument. "It clearly states that their estate is to be divided equally between both daughters, with no single beneficiary holding sole ownership of any assets." The shift in the room was immediate, the quiet murmurs of relatives who had blindly believed Vanessa now turning into hushed whispers of disbelief, of betrayal, of slow, dawning realization that they had been manipulated, that they had celebrated a lie, that they had stood by and applauded as she stole from her own family. I let the moment linger, let her feel the weight of every pair of eyes burning into her, let her sit in the consequences of her own actions, and for the first time in my life, I felt something dangerously close to pity for her. Because I knew that this was the moment she had never prepared for, the moment she had never thought would come, the moment where she had finally, truly lost. But then, just as I thought it was over, just as I thought she might finally accept defeat, just as I thought she might do the one thing she had never done in her entire life and take responsibility for what she had done, she did something that sent an icy chill down my spine, something that made my stomach twist with a sudden, sinking dread. She smiled. It wasn't the forced, strained smile of someone trying to save face, wasn't the embarrassed, half-hearted attempt of someone caught in a lie, wasn't even the bitter, angry sneer of someone realizing they had lost. No, it was something else entirely, something calm, something knowing, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end as she slowly leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, tilting her head slightly like she was enjoying some private joke at my expense. And then, in a voice so quiet, so deliberate, so unnervingly steady, she said, "You really thought this was over?" And that was when I realized that whatever final card Vanessa was about to play, I wasn't going to like it. Vanessa sat there with that unnerving smile still playing at the corners of her mouth, her fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood of the table, her entire demeanor shifting from cornered animal to calculated strategist, as if the last few minutes of her unraveling had been nothing more than an inconvenience rather than the complete destruction of the lie she had so carefully built. The lawyer's words were still hanging in the air, still echoing in the silence left behind, still sinking into the minds of the family members who had so easily believed her version of events. But I knew Vanessa well enough to understand that she was never the type to let reality stand in the way of her own self-interest. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply letting the weight of the situation settle around her, letting the tension thicken, letting everyone else shift uncomfortably in their seats as they waited for her to react, for her to break, for her to finally admit what she had done. But instead of backing down, instead of conceding, instead of acknowledging even a fraction of the truth, she did what she had always done best. She twisted the story in a way that no one saw coming. With a slow, deliberate exhale, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the relatives who had spent the past few weeks showering her with sympathy and praise, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, measured, carrying just the right amount of vulnerability to make it sound believable. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured, shaking her head slightly, her tone heavy with manufactured disappointment. "After everything I've done to make sure this family stays together, after all the sacrifices I've made, after all the pressure that's been put on me since Mom and Dad passed, this is how I get repaid?" I opened my mouth to argue, to cut her off before she could turn the conversation in her favor, but she barely even acknowledged me, her focus entirely on the people around us. The people she knew would hesitate before fully accepting that they had been played for fools. "You all know how much I loved them," she continued, her voice cracking just slightly, just enough to sell the illusion of heartbreak, of betrayal, of undeserved persecution. "You know how hard I've worked to make sure their affairs were handled properly, how much stress I've been under trying to do what's right for this family, how much I've given up to take care of things that no one else wanted to deal with." It was subtle, masterful even, the way she reframed the entire situation, turning herself into the victim, shifting the focus away from the undeniable fact that she had lied and onto the idea that she was being unfairly attacked, unfairly accused, unfairly targeted by me, the ungrateful sister who couldn't stand the idea of not being the center of attention. And I could see it happening, could see the way some of our relatives hesitated, glancing between us with uncertainty, struggling to reconcile the version of Vanessa they had believed in for so long with the version now sitting in front of them, desperately clinging to the last scraps of control she had left. "Think about it," she pressed on, her voice stronger now, her confidence returning as she sensed the smallest crack in their resolve. "Why would Mom and Dad have trusted me with everything if they didn't believe I was capable? Why would they have put that responsibility on me if they didn't think I could handle it? Do you really think they would have left something this important up to chance?" I clenched my jaw, fingers tightening against the armrests of my chair, because I could see it happening, could see the way she was shifting the conversation away from facts and into emotions, away from logic and into carefully crafted manipulation. And as much as I wanted to believe that the truth was enough to undo everything she had done, I knew better. The truth alone was never enough, not when you were dealing with someone like Vanessa, not when she had spent years perfecting the art of making herself seem untouchable. But just as I was about to argue, just as I was about to call her out, just as I was about to throw every last piece of proof I had directly in her face, the lawyer, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat and pulled something else from his briefcase, something smaller, something folded neatly into a separate envelope, something that immediately made Vanessa's expression falter in a way that she couldn't quite recover from. "I wasn't going to bring this up," he said, his tone calm, professional, unreadable. "But given the circumstances, I think it's only fair that everyone sees the full picture." And then he slid the envelope across the table, right in front of me. I hesitated for only a second before picking it up, my pulse pounding in my ears as I carefully unfolded the contents, my eyes scanning the first few lines before everything inside me went completely still, my breath catching in my throat as I realized exactly what I was looking at. It wasn't just another legal document. It wasn't just another amendment to the will. It was something so much bigger, something so much worse, something that no one, not even me, had seen coming. I lifted my gaze, locking eyes with Vanessa, watching as her mask finally cracked, as the carefully constructed version of herself she had so desperately clung to shattered right in front of everyone, because she knew exactly what this was. She knew that this wasn't something she could talk her way out of, wasn't something she could spin to her advantage, wasn't something she could pretend didn't exist. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof, that not only had she lied about the will, not only had she manipulated our family into believing her, not only had she tried to steal an inheritance that was never meant to be hers alone, but she had also forged legal documents to ensure that no one would ever question her story. She hadn't just bent the truth, she had committed a crime. The room was silent, heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed, and for the first time in her life, Vanessa had nothing to say. I exhaled slowly, setting the paper down in front of her, watching as she stared at it with wide, unblinking eyes, the realization sinking in that this was it, that there was no more fighting her way out, no more charming her way back into favor, no more pretending that she was anything other than exactly what she had always been. But even as I watched her unravel, even as I saw the carefully constructed pieces of her life fall apart right in front of her, even as I felt the cold satisfaction of knowing that I had won, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. That no matter how thoroughly I had destroyed her, no matter how much proof I had, no matter how completely she had lost, Vanessa was not the type to go down quietly. Because revenge is sweet. But it's never simple.